All right, so we are gathered back today to continue our march through the book of Esther, and we'll be doing chapter 2 today. As usual, we do start with our overview. So we've completed chapter 1, we did it in 2 lessons. And so the highlights from chapter 1, we found out that we had some of the original characters, and like in any good story, where it took place, a time period, and the characters that were introduced in chapter 1. So the identified place that this narrative took place was in the citadel of Susa, which is the capital of the Persian Empire. This was around 485 to 481 BCE. It was being governed at that time by a man known as King Ahasuerus is the Jewish name, and King Xerxes is the Greek name. And as we looked through that time period, we discovered this was the beginning of his reign. We talked about some of the revolts that were taking place, but mainly we talked a lot about the fact he was preparing to go to war against the Greeks. And so a lot of what we saw taking place in chapter 1, you needed to understand what he was doing, what his mindset was, and how he was governing to understand what we were seeing revealed in the first chapter. That second part of that chapter 1, we were introduced to another character, as would be standard when you're doing a story or a narrative. You continue to introduce the characters, and this character was Queen Vashti, and her refusal at the command from King Ahasuerus to come and display her royal crown and her beauty to the men that were gathered at the king's banquet. And then we looked at the results of her refusal to the king's command, which ended up being an edict that was brought by the 7 advisors to the king, that the queen was to be removed from her royal position in the court, and she was not to be in the king's presence again for the disgrace that she brought to the king, and by extension, they argued the disgrace that she brought to all the princes, all the men of the kingdom. So they didn't let it just be a personal indictment. It was a kingdom indictment against her. And we talked about some of the things that surrounded that. So with that background, chapter 1 takes place, as we know, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Ahasuerus. There are some details in chapter 2 that will identify the events unfolding that tell us that this chapter, so chapter 2, takes place about 3 years from chapter 1. So there's a gap of time between chapter 1 and chapter 2. There's a year that's described in this chapter we're getting ready to study, of beauty treatments that take a year for the beauty treatments to be complete. So there's 1 year that we know takes place before the end result that we find in chapter 2. But specifically in verse 16, we see that when Esther is made queen for King Ahasuerus, it's in the 7th year of his reign. So events of chapter 1 take place in the 3rd year, and the events of chapter 2 take place in the 7th year. So there's some historical events that have occurred between the ending of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. I'm going to spend a little time there, primarily because I continue to say that what is going on in the world around helps identify some of the details that are given in the scriptures. Not that we have to have it. We could study Esther without that and still see some very wonderful things revealed from God to us. But because we do have some of the details of what occurred between chapter 1 and chapter 2, I'm going to spend a little bit of time. So put on your history caps and join me as we are going to talk about some of the highlights. So some of the milestones, and trust me when I say this is a superficial, high-level overview. There's a whole lot there if you have a desire to go and study that part of history. Remember, Darius I had suffered a defeat, a significant defeat, and in historical context, it's referred to the Battle of Marathon that took place in 490 BCE. Basically, the Persians should have had the advantage. They had massive numbers that would have that should have taken them to a win over the smaller numbers of the Greeks and those who had decided to help out the Greeks. The Persians had the practice, or part of their military strength was because they had so many men, they had arrows that were very light and they could overwhelm their enemies with a ton or a barrage of these light arrows. However, the Greeks had developed a bronze armored shield that created an effective defense. So they would put the shields together and they could move as a wall towards the Persians. And so their little arrows weren't penetrating and weren't taking the men out as they had experienced previously, which allowed the Greeks to get close to the Persians, and then their superior bronze shields and weaponry would take out the Persians. So it was unexpected that they would lose. But that's a little of the strategic background of why the Persians actually lost. So then King Darius comes home, very upset. There's a whole lot of stuff you can read about that. He dies before he has completed the preparations to go back against the Greeks. So then we discussed how his son, King Ahasuerus, was going to take up that mantle. So he comes to being the king, deals with all the intrigue of becoming the king, the revolts that were taking place, but all the while he keeps his eye on what he sees as the prize. He's going to go after the Greeks, and this time he's going to succeed. So that's the desire of this king, and that's historically documented desire of this king. So Ahasuerus was then defeated at Thermopylae. And that was, again, they had overwhelming odds with the manpower. They should have won, but the Greeks at Thermopylae were able to delay the Persians long enough so the cities that they were trying to go take over and burn and all that they were going to do were able to put up their defenses better. It was the Spartans, that's the name of the individuals who basically sacrificed their life. All of them died in the process. It's where the movie 300, and there's been other movies made about that time period. So the Greeks all died, but they bought time for the cities to resist the Persian attacks, like I said. So the land battle was halted, and then winter set in, and so then the battle was taken to the seas. So the Persians were then routed or lost at the Battle of Salamis by a superior commander for the Greeks who lured them into the narrow straits so they couldn't get away, and he destroyed many of their ships. So they lose the land battle, they lose in the seas, and so they go home, kind of. Basically, war continued to simmer, and the Persians tried to gain the upper hand in political negotiations. So they decided, we can't just do this, so we'll do some political negotiating. When that didn't give them their desired result, which is they wanted to have the Greeks be part of their empire, then they engaged at Plataea in Boeotia in August of 479. Again, as against King Darius I, the superior shields and weaponry of the Greeks won out. Ultimately, the Greeks were left to their freedom for a time, and they flourished and they developed culturally with a lot of things that became very important to Western culture that we now enjoy, like democracy and things like that. So again, big picture, they should have lost, but God protected them, and many things grew out of that time period for the Greeks. But our story is about the Persians. So the Persian king, Ahasuerus, he did not seek to overtake the Greeks again. So King Ahasuerus then spent his time on building projects. So he had lavish spending on building projects. He still required money for war efforts because there's still revolts. He still has to show that he's going to defend his kingdom. And it put a great deal of strain on the monetary strength of the kingdom. Imagine that. Always preparing for war seems to take a lot of funds that could be used for other things. All right, so the scriptures don't take a lot of time to give us this kind of detail of the defeats of the Persian army, because the focus of the scripture is always on God's people. And so the battle that's ensuing is within the royal courts in Persia, and that's the story that we're going to be following. But don't forget what's going on outside. What's going on outside has influence on what's happening inside the walls. So with that background, we're going to start with chapter 2 of Esther, and we'll do the first 4 verses. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's attendants who served him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather every beautiful young virgin in the citadel of Susa to the harem, into the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given them. Then let the young lady who pleases the king be queen in place of Vashti." And the matter pleased the king, and he did accordingly. Surprise, surprise. So King Ahasuerus has now returned to do his governance duties back in the citadel of Susa after he's returning from this defeat. And it was a significant defeat. Now that he's home, the king doesn't seem to be as angry as he was before about the events that were depicted in Esther chapter 1. But it does appear that he is remembering the events and what they caused, and the decree that had been made against Vashti. The specific reference to the king no longer being angry and yet remembering could suggest the king's experiencing a sadness over the events and maybe longing for his beautiful wife, potentially. The scriptures are clear to refer to Vashti here as not Queen Vashti, as her position has been removed by the decree. This was most likely what the king's advisors had feared all along would occur. They knew their king, and why they spent time developing a strategy that would prevent Vashti from ever returning to the court. In verse 2, it defines that the king's attendants feel there is a solution for the king's restlessness, as they suggest, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Remember, the king would have been not shy of anything that he desired. This is a very specific request that they're taking, that they want to make the honeypot seem very, very special for this king. The names of the attendants are not listed here, but they may very well be the same attendants that we saw back in chapter 1. In verse 3, the details of how the women are to be found is given. It says, "Let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather every beautiful young virgin to the citadel of Susa, to the harem in the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given them." Breaking it down, because there's a whole lot that's tucked in there. So breaking down the plan, the first order of business would be for the king to find an overseer in each of the 127 provinces for the kingdom. An overseer would be someone who is to supervise this work. So it doesn't mean that the overseer went door to door to door. The supervisor or the overseer was to supervise as others within the kingdom were given the responsibility of to go village to village or town to town and find any beautiful young virgin that could be potentially brought for the king for him to accept her as his queen. A specific assignment would be to gather every beautiful young virgin to the citadel of the harem. This would be like we have in our modern day a beauty contest, without comparison to our modern day beauty contest, because the prize would be the position of queen over the entire Persian kingdom. The description includes the word every, and this should not be missed. This was a massive undertaking with no one to be missed who might meet the qualifications for the king. They were casting the net widely. Before we get carried away with the romance and the idea, let's look at the practical implications throughout the kingdom. Many of these young women may have previously been promised to another before this search was even carried out. As we know, the culture in that day, there were many arranged marriages. The unmarried men in the kingdom seeking their own wives would be without some options in their search. So see, we just hear about from the king's perspective, he's got the whole lot to choose from. What vacuum did it leave throughout the kingdom? What resentments could have been stirred by such an act for the king? On the other hand, this would be a sought-out honor for the women, for the families whose daughter might be chosen, as well as the province of which she would come from. All of that makes sense. She would be honored, her family would be honored, the province she comes from, all of it would have been seen as an honor for the ones selected, but for the others, not so much. There may have even been some payment that would have been offered to a family because they are giving up their daughter. That's not covered in the scriptures, but we just know in general the practices of that time. All the women were to live in the harem under the charge of Haggai. So all the women, as they're gathered and they're brought into Susa, this is where they would reside. The name Haggai also occurs as an officer of Xerxes in the histories of Herodotus. So it is a confirmation of this name from the Bible, also being found in outside biblical resources. While in the harem, the women are to let their cosmetics be given them. We're going to look more at that when we get to verse 12, because that's where we get more of the details on it. In verse 4, we get the conclusion of this venture as, then let the young lady who pleases the king be queen in place of Vashti. To the surprise of no one, and the matter pleased the king, and he did accordingly. King Ahasuerus was reported by historians to be a womanizer, and so the suggestion would definitely please this king. So we'll continue in the scriptures in chapter 2. We'll start with verse 5 and we'll read through 11. So Esther 2, beginning in verse 5. Now there was at the citadel in Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives, who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it came about when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa in the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. Now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him. So he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and food, gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. Every day, Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. Okay, so in verse 5, the narrative focuses specifically now at the citadel of Susa. And the next character of the story to be revealed is a Jew who's named Mordecai. He is the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Mordecai was already living at the citadel in Susa. So we've already ascertained that men serving at the citadel of Susa were highly regarded men, and they were representative of either a province or maybe a people group of the Persian Empire. So just that fact alone, that we learn where Mordecai was residing, tells us something about his position within the kingdom and within the court. Mordecai's family tree is listed here. It listed ending with the establishment of him being from the Jewish tribe of Benjamin. So that's an important fact for Jews to know, right? They're very much interested in what tribe are you from, right? Where's your daddy from? Where's granddaddy from? Where's great-great? Their genealogy was very important. So it's included here in the book of Esther. Verse 6 establishes that Mordecai's grandfather, Kish, was one who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled by Jeconian king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had exiled. So, for Old Testament reference, the events of this king being exiled are found in Jeremiah chapter 27, verses 19 and 20. So, Jeremiah chapter 27, verses 19 through 20. For thus says the Lord of hosts concerning the pillars, concerning the sea, concerning the stands, and concerning the rest of the vessels that are left in the city. So we're talking about things that were in the temple or in the city. So the things are listed, and we're going to find out they're removed from the temple and from the city, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, did not take when he carried into exile Jehoiakim, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from Jerusalem to Babylon, and all the nobles of Judah and Jerusalem. So this is where it's identified what's the word we want to use? The level of leadership that the men that were taken had obtained. The men taken were considered the nobles of Judah and were in Jerusalem. That makes sense. That's what the Babylonians practiced in their military control. They would come into a place, and if there was any form of rebellion, as the Jews were known to put up, and they did, they go in and take out the leadership, not everybody, not the peasants that work in the fields, not all the workers. They take the leadership because they're thinking that's where the rebellion comes from. You take the leaders and you take them back to Babylon, where you can control them, where you use them for your benefit. All of that we reviewed when we did the book of Daniel, because Daniel was one of the young men that was taken, and hear about his impact within Babylon as he was taken. The Medes and Persians had a different way to deal. So Babylon has collapsed as the Medes and Persians are now the world dominant power. They believed more in getting loyalty, but putting the leaders back in their territory, because for them to do that at their stage in history, it was seen as a reward now to those people. We get to go home. And the unspoken message is, yes, you do, but you better make sure you're going to pay tribute to me, the king that allowed you to go back. So all of this makes sense in our logical minds and in military use and all of that. So Nebuchadnezzar's removal of King Jeconiah from Jerusalem was in 597 BC. All the nobles of Jerusalem were included in this exile. Kish would have been in this group of people and have been one of the noble families of Israel. Mordecai was from the royal families of the Jews, from the tribe of Benjamin. And in verse 7, it tells us that he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. And now the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So the next character of the narrative that we're introduced to is that of Esther. She's introduced as Hadassah, as that is her Jewish name, and the name means myrtle. And then her Persian name, which was Esther, meaning star. And this could potentially be a reference to the star-like flower of the myrtle. So they may be connected in that way. So basically, we learn that Esther is Mordecai's cousin, as she's his uncle's daughter. Esther is without a living father or mother. However, her family line is also then from the royal family of Jews, just as Mordecai. He adopted her and was raising her as his own daughter. All of that is revealed in those couple of verses. Esther is described as the young lady was beautiful of form and face. In other words, she was perfect for a beauty contest. And verse 8 indicates what happens next and the result. So that is, it came about when the command and decree of the king were heard, and that many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa in the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken into the king's palace, into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. Notice, there is a command and a decree issued. So a command is an order given to be carried out as a task, but the decree is issued with the weight of law behind it. So you speak the words as the command, you're to go do all of this, but when it's put in the decree form, now there's a punishment if you don't do it, because now it's in the law form for you to do the command. So that's how they work together, and we talked about that a little bit from chapter 1. So as a result of the command, many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa and to the custody. So it is with this group of young women that we find out that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. To be clear, the scriptures are giving this detailed information to explain why a Jewish girl would be found in the harem of a Persian king. Mordecai and Esther were under command of this king. This was not an option for them to disobey the command. We don't know their attitude. That's not given to us. The detail just says, here's the command, and they obeyed. Kind of like, just the facts, ma'am. So that's what we have here. The narrative seems to move quickly, as in verse 9 it says, now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him, so he quickly provided her with the cosmetics and food, gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. She probably got the room with a view. So Esther pleased Haggai and found favor with him. We are not told how this was achieved. We just know that it is given as a conclusionary fact or truth. Haggai was in charge of the harem, and once he identified someone he thought would be the suitable woman for the job, he moved quickly to provide her with her cosmetics and food. So he's going to be in charge of all the young virgins as they're brought in. So he has his own reason for looking them over, getting to know them. For whatever reason, he meets this young woman and he's charmed by her. He's impressed by what he sees. And so he decides, I think this might be the one. I'm going to make sure that she gets the best room. I'm going to give her maids from the palace. I'm going to make sure her cosmetics start right away and she gets her food. I want this to go quickly for her. So he's identified Esther and he makes things happen. This might not be, or this could be one of those examples if it's not what you know, but it's who you know. And Esther had definitely impressed the right people. Again, these would be like the best cosmetics and the best food available in the kingdom. Secondly, we had seen that Haggai gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, so that's another huge benefit. 7 maids. That means she didn't have to lift a finger. These were women that were assigned to her to make sure she was taken care of, that her living quarters were clean, that every bit of the cosmetic process is followed, that everything is taken care of. Lastly, he transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. So it's important to remember the daily life and what it would have been like in the court of the king. Again, separate your mind from the romance novels. Separate it even from some of the movies that you might have seen that talk about the court and Esther being in the court, because they clean it all up for you. The court is a very dangerous place to be, especially as a young lady with what is being considered for that young lady to become. There would have been intrigue by the political rivalry that was taking place in this situation. Remember, every province would have wanted the honor of providing the king with the best queen and all that would have come with it. There were those most likely in the royal court who still might have had loyalties to Vashti and aren't happy about the circumstances at all. There were those who did not want to see King Ahasuerus succeed, as we will see displayed later in the same chapter. So we're not guessing on that. We see that it actually is played out. This would have been a place of intrigue and danger. Is it any wonder that Mordecai daily went to find out about how his daughter Esther was doing? In verse 10, it seems to indicate this truth, as Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, as Mordecai had instructed her, that she should not make them known. So what that means is Esther did not tell anyone of her Jewish descent. She does not say what family she is from or where her relatives are from. Some could point to this being an issue of contention against the morality of this Jewish girl, Esther. How can we look up to this person who may have lied about her background? That's not what we're told. She didn't lie. She just didn't fill in the blanks that she was of Jewish descent, as instructed by Mordecai. She can honestly say and respond that she is an orphan. Her mother and father are dead, and she is an orphan. What's interesting is that she carries out the instructions given to her by Mordecai, even though she had left home and is now residing in the palace with all the finer things of life being provided. Just as a little underscore of the significance of the character trait that reveals for Esther, most likely a young, say, teenager, and she's not an established woman in her 20s. She's young. She's a virgin. She's probably 15, 16, maybe 17 years old. How many of you currently know 15, 16, 17-year-old young ladies that could be pulled from their home, put in an environment where everything was given to them, and they would still listen to your advice or to their parents' advice? This is a big deal. This is a woman of character who admired the man that was her father, and she listened to his advice in the middle of the situation that she's in. She may have been fearful too. She may have understood just how dangerous the situation was. It would seem being a Jew in this time would have had added dangers for Esther, and he knew that. This also will bear out the truth in history of this time and to the further chapters that we get in later parts of Esther. It was dangerous to be a Jew. So it would appear Esther would then not have practiced, say, the rituals of the law in terms of the restrictions of food. So she's eating what they give her in the palace, because if she said, well, I can't eat, whatever, because she would have given away what Mordecai had asked her not to give away. So she's not following whatever the food restrictions are. She's most likely not practicing the festivals and feasts that the Jews would have practiced in that day. As a matter of fact, we don't even know that the Jews practiced all of these things when they're in exile. So we don't know that she was practicing it at home with Mordecai and then suddenly not here. She could have been, but what we know is in the palace, it's very specific. She was to give no indication of her lineage. So Mordecai now displays his true affection for Esther. In verse 11, it says that every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. There's no details given as to who would be giving Mordecai his update on Esther's well-being. It is possible it may be one of her maids. It could be Esther herself, but we're not told. It would just seem that Mordecai truly cared for Esther, and this may be the reason that she trusted his advice that he had given her not to reveal her lineage. That brings us to verse 12. So Esther 2, we'll do verses 12 through 14. Now when the turn of each young lady came to go into King Ahasuerus after the end of her 12 months under the regulations for the women, for the days of her beautification were completed as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with spices and the cosmetics for women. The young lady would go in to the king in this way. Anything that she desired was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in the custody of Shazags, or however you say that, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not again go to the king unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. So verse 12, it gives us a lot of information as to the processes that are involved before a young woman could be brought into the king's chambers. So first, we learn each woman would go in separately to King Ahasuerus. That's the first thing we learn. The visitation would not happen until there was a completion of 12 months, called the regulations for the women. Now think about it. This would have been a common practice for protection of the king. There was a careful and thorough examination of each woman during this time period. They're going to be looking for detections of things like disease or sickness. It's often the symptoms of disease take some time to make themselves known. They didn't have a med clinic down the road to zip her off to and take a blood sample and figure out what things might be lurking inside. So there's a period of time in which she's being observed, looking for any kinds of outbreak, something on the skin, fever, hair loss, whatever. Protection of the king is important. And you can't bring a woman in who might give something to the king. Secondly, it would be absolutely certain that this young woman was not with child before being with the king. So you put her isolated, you got your eunuchs watching out, that's where she is. No way she's going to come up pregnant after being with the king and be carrying a child that wasn't the king's heir. There's a lot of reasons, right? There's a lot of intrigue and probably stuff we don't even know. But just on the surface level, those two things would have been important. Next, the 12 months were divided into 6 months, beginning with the oil of myrrh. This oil is recorded as popular in other royal courts of the time, so it's not unique to the Persian courts. And it does have a reputation of containing anti-inflammatory, antiseptic, and expectorant properties. So those of you who are into oils and extracts and all the natural things, it was being practiced back then. You might give it a try. The second 6 months were spices and the cosmetics for women. From this time in history, this may have included things like hair removal, lightening the skin if they could, perfuming the skin and the hair with oils and incense, right? Everything about her would permeate whatever the scent was that would be pleasing to the king. There may also have been time, if you think about it, she's there for a year. You can only eat so much during the day, only do so many cosmetics. If you are training up potentially a woman who's going to be putting on the royal crown and be queen, she might need to be educated in the ways of the royal court. Who to curtsy to, how the silverware is laid out, right? Whatever what are you to wear? When are you to have your face covered? How are you to, all of the little details, all the etiquette. So it was kind of like, I don't know, finishing school for the queen. So there may have been a lot of things that these women were going through to educate them. Verse 13 begins by describing the young lady was to go to the king in this way. Anything she desired was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. So each woman is given a choice to take something that she desires, that she has when she's in the one harem as the virgin. She takes that with her because she doesn't get to go back to her room. She's leaving. She's going to go be with the king. When she's finished with her night with the king, she's now going to be moved to another room entirely. She doesn't get to go back. So she can take what she wants from the harem with her. This was something that she would have been given a considerable amount of time to think on, I can promise you. And she would have thought about this event and what she was going to take. So each young lady would have wanted to make a unique impression on the king. So they may have wanted to take something that set them aside, made them special, don't know. But verse 14 demonstrates the change in the young woman's life that would have happened after the evening with the king. So in the evening, she would go in, and in the morning, she would return to the second harem, to the custody of Shazags, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not again go into the king unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. No pressure at all. The young ladies would go to the king in the evening, and after that she would leave in the morning and be moved to a new location in the harem. She would enter a virgin, and she would leave a concubine of the king. Again, ladies, don't romance novel the events in the book of Esther or the royal courts. It's not cleaned up. She would leave the harem being managed by Haggai and be moved to the harem managed by Shazags. Her life changes. All that she had known, her routine, her friends, the way things were managed, all of that, after one night changes. She's in a new room, a new location, having to establish new relationships with the concubines, and all that goes with the court in the new role that she finds herself in. She would not go back to her family. She would live in the palace, and the palace would provide for her. She would not marry another, so this could be a very lonely existence. She would most likely not have a family of her own. If she did have a child, a male child in particular, the son would not be considered in line for the throne. That's why it was important that the king have a queen. Esther chapter 2, we'll do verses 15 through 18. So Esther chapter 2, verses 15 through 18. Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, came to go into the king, she did not request anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So, Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his princes and his servants. He also made a holiday for the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's bounty. So, verse 15 gives insight again into the character of Esther as we're reminded of her family connections. Her father was Abigail, and that her cousin was Mordecai, and that he took her as his daughter. When it was the evening in which the young woman would go into the king, she also asked what Haggai advised her to take. It would seem that Esther took counsel from those around her, which would display a humble spirit. The scriptures say that Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. That's a big compliment. She found favor with Mordecai as he took her as his daughter. She found favor with Haggai as he quickly brought her into the harem. Remember, quickly, that word quickly was there. It was a pretty quick thing that he put her in and moved her to the good place and brought the maids and got the cosmetics started over all the other virgins. So he's already picked her as his favorite. Verse 16 gives us the detail of when these events took place. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So again, time is revealed in the scriptures often through the year of the reign of the king. And so here we find that same time element. So this is the confirmation of the historical timeline where this narrative takes place. This would have been, again, reminder, 4 years from the time the king had issued his edict against Vashti. This would be one of the areas of concern for the Jews reading this narrative regarding Esther, as it would display a young Jewish virgin going to be with a Gentile married man from their perspective. This would be a violation of Jewish law, and it could be seen as a disgrace to some. This became a moral struggle to many Jews to put this in a positive light, as it would appear they needed to do years later, because Esther would now need to be presented as a Jewish heroine for the good things that she does. This is why the rabbis took care to write history to put Esther in a better light as compared to Vashti. The scriptures do not put any such twist in the narrative. It simply states facts. We're not making a moral judgment on what Esther did. She was commanded to be taken in as a virgin and to go in preparation to be with the king, and she did exactly as she was instructed. And the scriptures would indicate she found favor. She was humble in character, and God is going to use that in a mighty way, no matter what man thinks about the lineup of events that take place. God uses all events of history to bring himself glory, even in the parts that seem mired in darkness. God's glory is what matters. Verse 17 displays the response of the king after his evening spent with Esther. As we read, the king loved Esther more than all the women. She found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. He set the royal crown on her head and made her queen. Esther was compared first to all the women in the king's harem. This would be both the concubine side, right? Because those are the ones he's been with, as well as the virgins, as he has found favor and kindness with her. It's not that he didn't know that the other virgins existed and that they were there, but he's decided, whatever, he walked through, I don't know, somebody walked through and said, there's nobody better. And he said, well, I already liked her. We're just all the women and all the virgins. So we're not to be in any confusion that there's a representation of everybody involved in this relationship with the king. This is who he chose. Result was the king set the...
I'm sorry.
Sorry. My watch does that all the time. I don't know what word I use. It suddenly sets it off to talk to me, but there you go. The result was the king set the royal crown on her head, and she was selected to be the queen. So, just in one fell swoop, we have this little sentence. Let's think about the impact of that. This young teenager is now going to step into the role of queen of the Persian Empire. Those are some big shoes to fill. Really big shoes. The king only has one queen at a time, one wife he considered to be his queen. Not that he didn't have concubines, not that he didn't have physical relationships with women, but there was a special title given, and it was queen. That was his wife. And there were special honors and privileges that went with that. This is a big deal. And in verse 18, it describes what the king does next. Then the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his princes and servants. And he also made a holiday for the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's bounty. So the king is happy once again, and he celebrates by giving a great banquet for all his princes and servants. So again, we're back to having parties at the palace, like we saw in chapter 1, probably really big deals, which it can be if somebody else is doing all the work for you. I would entertain a lot more if somebody could do all the work for me. The king also shared his joy with the kingdom by making a special holiday to mark the event throughout all the provinces and giving gifts. He wants everybody to be happy. That's his desire, is that everybody is to join in his joy that he has found a queen. So back to Esther chapter 2, we'll read verses 19 through 23. When the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther did what Mordecai told her, as she had done when under his care. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials, from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai. He told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now, when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. Like any good story, we have all the details unfolding here that will be drawn on later as the story continues to unfold. In verse 19, it describes another event in the citadel of Susa. So we still have the stage set up, if we're going to do this in play form, as the citadel of Susa. When the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. So the description of gathering the virgins together the second time has been debated by many, with a lot of differing opinions as to what it stands for. Looking back at verse 17, we know Esther found favor and kindness more than all the virgins. These are those who still had hoped for an opportunity to impress the king, but Esther found favor and kindness. The contest is over. These are the contestants that were in the wings, and they're gathered together for some reason. The important part of the verse is describing that time period in connection with Mordecai being at the gate or sitting in the king's gate. That's the importance. There was this second gathering. It occurred while Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate. So just for a moment, we'll talk about the gate of a city and how it's where official business was conducted. I know for me, when I first read gate, I was like, oh, you see the little picket fence and then there's the gate you open. That's a gate in our mind. Gate here took on a whole new meaning. It would be an area or a room in which official business took place. We get a description of that in Ruth chapter 4. So we'll just do first 2 verses of Ruth chapter 4. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and he sat down. He took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. So in a smaller community, we find Boaz calling for witnesses in a legal matter, right, in the book of Ruth. In a big capital city like Susa, to be a man sitting in the king's gate would be of significantly higher responsibility, right? This is the capital of the Persian Empire. It's a big deal that he's sitting in the gate. Why was he there? We don't know. Could it have been that because his daughter's made queen, he's given special privileges? We don't know. That's not what we're told here. Verse 20 reiterates that Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther did what Mordecai told her, as she had done when he was under her care. Listen to that. Esther is still listening to the direction of her adopted father, Mordecai, even though she is no longer under his care, but has been crowned queen. This again displays her humble character. She doesn't have to listen to what Mordecai has to say. She's the queen. She doesn't have to listen to anybody, really. She's the queen. The scriptures go out of their way, though, to say she's queen, and yet she still listens to the counsel of Mordecai. Verse 21, it discloses a significant event. It says, in those days, and it's highlighted, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's officials, from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the relevance of in those days is tied to the event where the virgins were gathered together a second time, which was also a time in which Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate. Those two are linked. During this particular time, 2 men who were described as officials in the king's court, who were to guard the door of the king's gate, become angry enough to try and kill King Ahasuerus. We don't know why. We're just told they're angry. We're given the timeline to know what position Mordecai was holding when this event occurred. Tensions were probably running high for a lot of reasons. But for the young virgins who were to be sent home, their delegates might have been offended that they were not given an opportunity. I know this is speculation, but it would seem that somehow the 2 events are tied together. The gathering of the virgins, which would mean that this is a gathering not so they can talk about who's going to try again. This is probably a gathering of, thanks for showing up, thanks for giving it your all and your best, but we found our contestant winner and you get to go home. That's the gathering of the virgins. What happens during that gathering time is Mordecai is in the gate. So we're told that he has this high position within the gate at the same time that this is occurring. It would seem to link that something about that event causes these 2 to be angry. We have to be careful because it doesn't specify that. I'm just saying it's interesting that those 2 things were tied together and then we're told these men were angry. And if you know the future history, I don't like to give away the endings of the story, but that's exactly what ends this king's life, is an assassination. So there were attempts all the time. Again, I underscore there's danger in the royal court. It is not the happy place that a lot of, books and novels have been written to find the good parts. There were good parts, but there's also a lot of risk. King's life was always something that they needed to protect. Somebody was always out to take down the king. And I would contend also the queen. Esther's life is in a situation of peril in that she must be very, very aware of her surroundings. And her father knows that. And so he's dedicated himself to hearing all the stuff that's going on. And as he's trying to make sure he's got connections and finding out what's going on, he happens to uncover there's a plot to kill the king. So in verse 22, we hear that the plot became known to Mordecai, and he translated the message to Queen Esther. It was then Esther who told the king the information she had received, and she said she got it from Mordecai. Now, why was the best way to communicate with the king about such a dangerous situation to be the queen? Didn't he have bodyguards? Weren't there other established methods of whistleblower, established in the kingdom? I don't know. But for whatever reason, Mordecai didn't trust anybody else with that information. He only trusted his daughter, and so he gave it to his daughter. And the daughter trusted the information from Mordecai. Again, we have that trust issue going on here. She trusted what he had to say. She doesn't question him. How'd you know? She says, okay, I'm going to let the king know, and she does. And she lets the king know why she knows this and who it came from. Because don't you think there might be a little suspicion when the queen happens to come in with some information that's that valuable? Who are you talking with, Queen Esther? Where are your loyalties? Where are you getting your information, right? There's going to be a lot of questions about who your friends are in this kind of a court situation. Finally, in verse 23, the result of this revelation is that there was an investigation, and the report was verified with the conclusion that both men were to be hanged on the gallows. As with every important event that transpired during the king's reign, this one was written in the books of the Chronicles in the king's presence. First of all, we're going to talk a little bit more later in the book about what it means to be hanged on gallows. But don't put in your mind those old westerns that you watched, right, with the platform and the rope around the neck and that hanging. This was a gallows, and we'll see one built later in the book, and we'll talk about exactly what that meant. This was pretty horrific, and it was done in public form to incite incredible fear of ever having anybody else do what these men do, or any man that's hung on the gallows. So to these books, these chronicles, the books contain the king's written record, which we talked about last week. All of that would have been destroyed in the fire that took out this palace and any of the storage rooms or whatever else existed during the reign of Artaxerxes I, which was his son. So the written documents didn't last all that long. They were destroyed. How amazing is it that the events that were recorded for us in this book survived such a fire? God saved exactly the parts of this narrative that he desired to save in exactly his way. The coincidences just seem to stack up in this story. So we have a king that is ready to carry out his duties as king now that the wars have subsided with the Greeks. So that's kind of the first thing in history. He just happens to be done running around the kingdom, leading wars and battles. There's basically a Jewish princess that's not identified publicly as a Jewish princess, and she happens to already reside at the citadel of Susa. Interesting. Oh, she happens also to be beautiful, humble, obedient, wise, and charming. She happens to have all of those elements of importance. She catches the attention of Haggai, an important official in the king's service, one who happens to control the daily lives of the virgins that are brought to the king. Just happens to be the guy. It just happens to be in the most important position for the selection of the queen. The king just happens to adore her as well as selecting her to be queen, just by chance. Her adopted father happens to be sitting in the king's gate when a plot to kill the king is discovered and thwarted. So, with all of these coincidences lining up, of course, we'll talk about that more as the story unfolds. What are the coincidences that are stacking up in your life? Are there a lot? God's hand is always at work. Have you seen the hand of God bringing unexpected events to some amazing outcome in your own walk, in those that you know who follow the Lord? Do you hold all the things in your life in an open hand towards God as you ask to understand His will and determined to give Him full charge and credit for all things, every miracle? Sometimes even the miracle of just waking up and literally getting out of bed. We should give praise to the Lord, exactly. Let's look in Proverbs. We'll end here in Proverbs chapter 3, and I'll be reading verses 3 through 8. So Proverbs 3, verses 3 through 8. Do not let kindness and truth leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. You will find favor and good repute in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. For the Lord, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to the body and refreshing to your bones. We need to stand very firmly on this under all situations and circumstances. But just as a reminder, if you flip on the news or if you deal with situations in your own life, what does it say? Do not let kindness and truth leave you. Do not let kindness and truth leave you to appease anyone. Standing for truth, doing it with kindness. That's what we're called to do, even in our culture. And do not lean on your own understanding. That means don't let whatever can be processed here be the only thing that directs you in what you do. Go to your heart and turn it over to the Lord. You are not going to have an understanding of everything going on around you or why it's going on. And some people feel, oh, I must stop this. I must. Must you? What does God direct you to do in your life? And that's where you keep your focus. Keep it simple. It doesn't need to be complicated. And the scriptures are complete with this. I have a plan. I am God. My plan will always take place. And from your perspective, it's going to look like a whole stack of coincidences. But I am God, and my will be done. That's the God we serve. And we can let go of a whole lot of disturbing things in our life, the things that bring us anxiety and fear and anger and all those things. We can better let go of that when we truly embrace He has a plan, and His plan will be what unfolds. It will happen because He's God. And when we study Scripture, like the Old Testament, in a story like Esther, it is to remind us that these people didn't see the big picture of what was going on. They don't know the end of the story as we're walking through this the way we do. So keep that in perspective as you read this. Esther doesn't know what's going to happen in her future. She's got no idea. She doesn't know if she's going to be assassinated the next year. She doesn't know. She doesn't know how God's going to use her and Mordecai and all the end of the story. She probably had a whole lot of fears, I can promise you, in the natural flesh that you would have, being taken from your home, being taken to this royal court, being tossed into the mix of what was probably very eye-opening. And yet the indication is she stayed steady, and God provided a way, and He gave her counsel, and she availed herself of it. She followed exactly what God provided for her, even in her worldly existence. Dad with counsel, a man that was over the harem of the virgins who gave her special consideration, and she listened to his counsel. Those are heart issues, and this is a woman with great character. And with that great character, we can already see her demonstrating courage. She didn't have to take the message from Mordecai to the king. She didn't have to be the one bearing that. She could have just ignored it. I don't want to bring any attention to myself. I don't want to ruffle any feathers. She doesn't do that. So with her character in humility seems to come amazing courage. So it doesn't just show up later in the book. It's already evident at the beginning chapters in the book of Esther.